Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure I won't speak too fast. We have the opposite problem in Australia. We speak too slowly. It's very hot. We also have the problem that we tend to speak without opening our mouths, because there are in the rural areas there are a lot of flies. If you open your mouth, you're likely to swallow a fly. So we tend to mumble, but I'll try not to. I'd like to begin by congratulating the Association for the inscription of the Climat de Bourgogne on the World Heritage List. It's been a very long process, as we heard yesterday from Crystal, and it's astonishing the amount of work that has gone into this process. And I'd also like to congratulate Aubert de Villain and Isabelle for having the confidence to see that a culmination, in some sense, of this process should be an international symposium like this one, bringing together experience about terroir-based economies. There was discussion about the word terroir, and in fact it needs no translation into other languages. We use that word in Australia to describe our wine-producing districts. It has very much resonance with the sorts of examples that we've been hearing from other countries. The task of the keynotes yesterday and today, as Guillaume said in his introduction, is to sketch some of the concepts and the principles which we should be paying attention to in thinking about heritage-based economies. Now, I'm an economist. I've been interested in, well, I should say to begin, I'm actually very well qualified to talk about terroir-based economies because I began my life as an agriculturalist. I did my first degree in agriculture at the University of Sydney. I was never very good at being a scientist, and so I moved to the social sciences, economics, and I practiced as an agricultural economist for quite a few years before I moved more towards the economics of art and culture, and I've worked on the economics of art and culture now for something like 30 years. It's been quite a long time. That's an economist interested in culture is a rather unusual species, because most economists don't care about culture or don't think it's important. But there is an area of economics which is called cultural economics, or the economics of art and culture. And the thing which distinguishes those of us who practice in this area, such as Françoise Benamou yesterday and many others, is that we recognise the importance of economic evaluation of culture, but we recognise also that that's not the whole story by any means. And economists tend to think that if you can't measure it in financial terms, then it doesn't matter. And what we have been concerned to do has been to separate out the concepts of value into those aspects of value that we can measure with the tools of economic analysis and express in financial terms, and separate those out from what we would call cultural value, which can't be expressed in financial terms, but is nevertheless important. And so this, if you like, duality of value, the distinction between economic value and cultural value, is something which has become fundamental to the ways in which, as cultural economists, we think about the nature of the economics of art and culture. Now, I want, in the very brief time that I have this morning, to say something about the way the economics of heritage is useful and important, perhaps, in thinking about terroir-based economies. The economics of heritage has become quite an active specialisation within the whole field of cultural economics. And there's quite a literature has now developed on the economics of cultural heritage. I want to consider three aspects. First of all, I want to talk about cultural capital. Secondly, value, questions of value and valuation, which of course are fundamental. And thirdly, I'll say some remarks about sustainability, which of course has also been very widely mentioned at this conference. The first point I want to make, by the way, I should say I don't have any pictures, they're all words. I hope that doesn't send you to sleep. The first thing, cultural capital has emerged as a really fundamental concept in economics. Now, those of you who are sociologists will know cultural capital as something which has been discussed at great length in sociology following the works of Pierre Bourdieu, the well-known French sociologist. He has a view of, or an interpretation of cultural capital that has to do with individual cultural competence and is quite different from the way in which this word is used in economics. In economics, we think of capital as an asset, indeed, and cultural capital is an addition to the range of different sorts of capital that economists identify, because it is seen to be something which expresses something about the nature of cultural assets which sets them apart from other sorts of assets. If you think about the ways in which the classical economists in the 19th century thought about production, they thought about land, labour, capital. Those were the three things which were important to produce the output of the society. And capital, in that sense, meant equipment, buildings, physical capital, and so on, combined with land and labour to produce things. Well, if you think about assets which have cultural value, that's what sets them apart. You can think about a building, let's say Notre Dame, just across the way from here. It's a building, it's a piece of physical capital, because it has an economic price. You could sell it, I suppose, if you wanted to. You could convert it into apartments, I suppose, if you wanted to. But it would have an economic value of some sort. But of course, that's not the point. The point is that it is a piece of physical capital which has cultural value, and that means that it can be regarded as a piece of cultural capital, an asset with that sort of value. And so we have come to define capital assets in the cultural sphere as being cultural capital. Can be tangible or intangible, as Elizabeth pointed out in her presentation. It's a very clear distinction between the sorts of assets which have cultural value, which are tangible, which we can see, and those which are not. Now, that's appropriate to apply it to the notion of a terroir-based economy, or of a terroir. But there's something more about terroirs which makes them distinctive, and that is that they also represent another form of capital, also recognised by economists, which is natural capital. That is natural resources, the natural capital of the land. And so the distinctive characteristic of a terroir is that it is a combination of these two forms of capital. It has cultural value, but it is also natural capital. And one of the things which has emerged in the study of heritage economics and cultural capital has been that there are actually very close parallels in theoretical terms between the two concepts, natural capital and cultural capital. Let me try to explain this in terms of a diagram. On that slide, you'll see natural capital and cultural capital compared. And you'll see how close they are together. Natural capital consists of the renewable and non-renewable resources which are inherited from the past, which are created by nature, and which impose on us a duty of care to look after them for the benefit of future generations. And it also, natural capital also includes cultural ecosystems, natural ecosystems, the relationships between species and natural systems that are important, essential to maintain life on the planet, and also, importantly, biodiversity, diversity of species. And then if you look at cultural capital, the parallel is almost exact, in that cultural capital consists of tangible and intangible cultural resources or assets, cultural ecosystems, the networks of cultural relationships which are important to the culture, and cultural diversity. So we have these three characteristics which are exactly parallel. And likewise, cultural capital has been inherited from the past in one way or another, maybe the distant past, maybe the very recent past, but it has come to us as heritage. It's created by humans, not by nature. But also, in exactly the same way, it imposes on us a duty of care. We have a responsibility to care for cultural capital, just as we have a duty of care to take care of natural capital. And the final thing which brings these two things together is that both natural capital and cultural capital support the real economy. Now, if instead of the real economy, I said terroir-based economy, the regional economy, it would mean the same thing. So I think that the notion of the terroir as being a combination of these two forms of capital is an important concept to understand. Let me turn now to the question of value and the distinction between economic and cultural value, which I mentioned before. How should we interpret these two concepts, economic and cultural value, in the context of a terroir-based economy? Let's turn first of all to economic value. We can say that the assets which are represented in a terroir, like the Climat de Bourgogne, consists of all of the market values. We call them market values because that means they can be assessed in financial terms by things that people do, the ways in which production is sold on markets, and there are revenue flows to the region from the sale of the products of the region. And there are other aspects which also have a direct financial contribution, such as the brand value which is associated with the various vineyards and marks which are produced there, the tourist benefits, the inflows of tourism, which of course in many heritage-related projects is one of the most important sources of revenue. And there may be flow-on or multiplier effects, which is that, you know, if the tourists come, they go to restaurants, they hire taxis and so on, and that contributes to the local regional economy. In addition to this, as Françoise pointed out yesterday morning, there are what we call non-market values. These are the sorts of values which arise because people value heritage, even though they may not necessarily visit it or participate in it or consume its products in some direct way. So people all over the world know about the Burgundy region, and there is probably some willingness to say that we value the existence of this region, even though we may not necessarily visit it or even drink the products of the wines that come from the region. It's just simply known that Burgundy is an important region. And Françoise Benamou pointed this out yesterday, saying that just simply the existence of heritage is something which people value. The option, perhaps, of visiting it sometime, even if they haven't yet, may be something that they value. And also, particularly, the bequest value, that is, the value of being able to hand on the assets to future generations in a way which acknowledges the responsibility that we have for that. And so these are all non-market values in the sense that we don't see them reflected in statistics, but we do understand that they could be valued in economic terms and should contribute to any assessment of the total value of an asset. Now, when we come to measurement, we have a different issue, because if we're going to distinguish between economic and cultural value, one of the problems that we have is that economic value can be measured in monetary terms, and that's very easy, or, well, it may not be all that easy to measure it, but nevertheless the understanding of what is meant by 100 euros or 1 million euros is something which everybody understands, so that if we can express the value of assets, either of the services that they produce or of the value of the assets themselves, in terms of euros, in terms of money, then that's something we can all understand. So to gather together the various components of economic value and express them in a total monetary valuation is reasonably clear and straightforward. But when we turn to cultural value, by definition, we don't measure that in monetary terms. We can't. It's multifaceted, has many dimensions, and there's no single unit of account that we can use. So we need some sort of holistic approach to this, in which we can measure both the economic and the cultural value, and this is the process of valuation. In the case of economic value, the market values that I mentioned are reasonably easily obtainable. So if we're thinking about doing some sort of economic evaluation of the clima or the region, we would look at regional and local statistics about value of production and so on. We could look at the records of the companies and the businesses which work in the region. We could do surveys of businesses, tourists. We can find these sorts of data. In the case of non-market values, as I mentioned before, we don't have statistical sources to turn to. We have to measure these ourselves. They're still just as important, and in fact, in many heritage studies, it's been found that the non-market values are more economically valuable than the ones that we can directly measure, because people really do have strong valuations of heritage, which they don't express through their market transactions. Maybe they're not able to, but nevertheless, these things are there. In economics, we refer to these things as willingness to pay. How much would people be prepared to pay to contribute to a fund to support heritage restoration or conservation in a certain area? That would be the way one might phrase a question. How much would you be prepared to pay to contribute towards a fund, or to pay through your local taxation, or something like that? There's very complicated and quite refined methods now available and used by economists to measure these sorts of non-market values. And they're called contingent valuation methods, and I won't go into those now because that's a whole lecture in itself. But what I want to say is that it's possible to measure these things, and they shouldn't be neglected, in the sense that the total economic value, if we're really going to be serious about that, should consist of both the market and the non-market components. And that presents a challenge, because the second part of that, the non-market values, have to be somehow or other assessed. But the techniques and the methods for doing this are there. Okay, what about cultural value? Cultural value, as I said, of course, is something which is multi-dimensional. The first thing we should be able to do in thinking about cultural value is to deconstruct it, if you like. That is, instead of just talking in general terms about cultural value, the value of culture, let's be more precise about what we mean when we talk about the value of culture. And I think we could say that there are many ways in which one could express these various dimensions, that we have a saying in Australia, there are many ways to skin a cat. I don't quite know why anybody would want to skin a cat, but, but there are many ways in which we could deconstruct the notion of cultural value. That's one suggestion. Aesthetic, let me go into another slide which gives a little bit more detail of this. The sort of criteria that we might be talking about, aesthetic value, beauty, authenticity, these are the sorts of things which clearly and obviously must be seen to be part of cultural value. The beauty, the aesthetic qualities of the terroir, the aesthetic qualities of the wine are all part of the cultural value which is created. Symbolic value, that is really at the heart of it, because the notion of the identity, the sense of the narrative which comes from heritage is symbolic of something, and that's a part of the value. Community involvement, again, as Elizabeth was talking about, that's essential to creating the social value of heritage. Historical value, again, the continuity that heritage implies between the past and the present. Educational value, again, we know that is something which is important, particularly in terms of future generations, educating children and so on. So these are all things which we need to take into account, and again, many researchers are working now on ways in which we can be more precise about measurement of cultural value. And that's an ongoing project which, if we were having this discussion in 10 years' time, I could perhaps be much more precise or indicate many more examples of the ways in which this is being done. It's a work in progress. Finally, let me talk about sustainability. Sustainable development is very much on the agenda these days, both nationally and internationally. I think there was mention yesterday of the post-2015 agenda for the United Nations with the new Sustainable Development Goals, and the question which is all important is, where does culture fit in this whole issue? We know that sustainable development, as the concept has developed over the years since the Brundtland Report of 1987, the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development back in the 1980s, a long time ago, but that provided a definition of sustainable development which is still valid today, and it essentially says what we need to do in development is to meet our present needs, but to do that in a way which is going to safeguard the needs, the capacity of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's the critical issue. The long-term sustainability is something which is essential to this notion. And you can see that there's an emphasis on the human side of this, which again is consistent with the theme of this conference. But much of the discussion about sustainable development has, not surprisingly, been about environmentally sustainable development. And even in the new goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, these are really at the forefront of the discussion. And it's not surprising. Climate change is perhaps the most important environmental issue facing the planet today, and the need to take action is clear. And so the idea that there should be goals which have that as a centrepiece is clear. But nevertheless, there is a question in terms of the sustainability of culture, which is also important and which can't be overlooked. And that brings us to the question of, where does cultural heritage fit into the sustainable development paradigm? And I think what we can say is that because of the similarity or the parallel between natural capital and cultural capital that I mentioned before, the notion of sustainability in ecological or environmental terms looking after natural capital sustainably, has a parallel in the cultural sphere, because we can talk about cultural sustainability as being caring for cultural assets, following the same sorts of principles as we use when we're talking about the environment. And so my last slide is to say that there is an emerging paradigm which we can call culturally sustainable development, which sits alongside ecologically sustainable development. Ecologically or environmentally sustainable development is a well-established concept. Culturally sustainable development is now starting to take its place as an equivalent concept which we have to be conscious of. And I think that the critical point that I would like to conclude with is that the terroirs represent, in a sense, a paradigm case of the combination of environmentally and ecologically sustainable development with culturally sustainable development. Because of this fact that they have these two, it represents the merger of these two types of capital, natural and cultural capital, and the sustainable management of those two types of assets together, bringing them together into a complete system, is a very powerful concept. And I think that as an argument in going to UNESCO with the proposition for inscription, it would seem to me that that would be, amongst all the other arguments, that would be a very powerful one to put. Thank you.